Today, you will learn a brutal story about what happens to those who are seen as different within the prison system. In an environment marked by prejudice, violence, and unwritten laws, keeping a secret can cost you your life. Surviving there requires more than strength. It requires courage to face the worst side of human beings. Put on your headphones and prepare for an intense narrative where every second could be your last. On May 3rd, 2019, Alejandro Ortega walked through the rusty gates of the Nuevo Leon State Penitentiary in Mexico. The sentence was clear: for years for tax fraud. To many, it seemed like a disproportionate punishment, but Alejandro knew there was no escape. His mistake, made in the sterile environment of a corporate office, had placed him in a place where nothing was sterile and where chaos was a norm. From the moment the bars closed behind him, Alejandro felt like the world he knew was behind him. In the screening sector, he was greeted with indifference by guards who barely looked at the prisoners. Each of the new detainees was placed in a line, where their names were recorded, fingerprints taken, and belongings confiscated. Block C, a guard announced in a monotone voice, pushing Alejandro forward. "Good luck, newbie." The phrase didn't seem to be said with compassion, but with a touch of irony that Alejandro couldn't ignore. Block C was famous within the penitentiary. Overcrowded, chaotic, and ruled by gangs, it was a place where no one was safe for long. Alejandro was led through dark, stuffy corridors as he tried to ignore the stares of prisoners who assessed him like a new animal at the zoo. When he arrived at his assigned cell, he found 5 men piled into a space designed for 2. The prisoners watched him in silence, some with curiosity, others with contempt, as he dragged his mat to the corner and made himself comfortable as discreetly as possible. The first night was endless. The constant noise of footsteps in the corridor, muffled conversations in neighboring cells, and the occasional knock on iron bars kept Alejandro awake. But what disturbed him most were the looks. He could feel the others' eyes locked on him, even in the dark. The feeling of vulnerability was suffocating. He knew he was in a place where any display of weakness would be exploited. The next morning, Alejandro was introduced to the courtyard, the heart of the prison. It was there that prisoners spent 2 hours a day in an open-air space, divided into small groups. Alejandro chose to stay close to the wall, trying not to attract attention. He observed the groups that dominated the space: organized gangs, small band of smugglers, and a few lone men who, like him, tried to disappear into the crowd. It was on that day that Alejandro noticed a guard watching him. Ramirez, as the label on his uniform indicated, was a middle-aged man with shrewd eyes and a faint smile that never seemed friendly. Alejandro didn't notice right away, but Ramirez was watching him with unusual interest. As Alejandro moved around the courtyard, the guard's gaze followed him, assessing him, as if trying to read him. At first, Alejandro ignored it. He knew that the guards were unpredictable figures in that environment. Some were just negligent, while others were actively cruel. But as the days passed, it became impossible to ignore. Ramirez always seemed to be around, whether in the courtyard, the cafeteria, or even during the nightly count. It was as if he was waiting for the right moment to act. The confrontation finally took place on a sultry afternoon, 2 weeks after Alejandro's arrival. Ramirez approached him in the hallway as the inmates returned from working in the yard. "Ortega, right?" he asked, stopping in front of him. Alejandro nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "You look different from the others," Ramirez continued, with a smile that didn't inspire confidence. "A special kind." The insinuation was clear, and Alejandro felt his stomach turn. He didn't know how Ramirez had come to that conclusion, but he feared the consequences. He just shook his head, tried to avoid further conversation, but Ramirez didn't seem willing to let him go so easily. "Be careful, Ortega," the guard said, before lightly patting Alejandro on the shoulder. "In here, secrets don't stay hidden for long." Those words echoed in Alejandro's mind throughout the night. He knew he was in a dangerous position. In prison, any suspicion about his sexual orientation could make him a target of violence, not only from prisoners, but also from the guards themselves. Ramirez seemed to have realized this and was determined to exploit this vulnerability. In the 3rd week, Ramirez showed his true intentions. After the night count, he called Alejandro out of the cell. "I need to talk to you, Ortega. It's important." Alejandro hesitated, but he knew that refusing could be even worse. He followed the guard to a room near the security office, where Ramirez closed the door behind him. "I'll be blunt," Ramirez said, crossing his arms as he looked at Alejandro. "I know about you. I know you're different." Alejandro felt his heart race. Ramirez continued, his voice taking on a more threatening tone. "In here, secrets like yours can be dangerous, but I can help. I can make sure no one touches you. Of course, that comes at a price." Alejandro remained silent, trying to process the situation. Ramirez gave a cynical smile. "Do you have any money saved, Ortega? Because if you don't, you'll need to find another way to pay me." The implied suggestion was as clear as the threat that accompanied his words. When Alejandro returned to his cell that night, he felt as if he was being suffocated by an invisible wall. The curious gazes of his cellmates seemed to weigh even more heavily on him as he lay down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. He knew that hell had just begun. The days after meeting Ramirez became an exercise in survival for Alejandro. He knew he'd been ensnared in something much bigger than he could handle. The guard's presence seemed omnipresent, a constant reminder that his secrets were no longer under his control. Ramirez didn't need to repeat the threat. His look and his actions were enough to make it clear that Alejandro was at the mercy of his decisions. At first, Alejandro tried to keep a low profile, hoping that Ramirez would lose interest. But it didn't take long for the guard to pressure him again. One afternoon, while Alejandro was in the courtyard, Ramirez called him out of the group. The tone of his voice was calm, but loaded with authority. "We need to talk, Ortega," he said, motioning for Alejandro to follow him to a secluded area near the entrance gate. "Did you think about what we talked about?" asked Ramirez, leaning against the wall and crossing his arms. Alejandro tried to give an evasive answer, saying he had no money or resources. But Ramirez was unimpressed. "I know someone like you has something to offer," he insisted, with a sly smile. "And if it's not money, we can find another way." Alejandro felt the pressure increase. Ramirez was testing his limits, making it clear that his safety depended on his obedience. The threats were always veiled, but impossible to ignore. In the cafeteria, while Alejandro was trying to eat in peace, Ramirez walked past him and whispered something in his ear, like, "Remember, Ortega, secrets don't last long here." Every day, the feeling of vulnerability increased. One night, the situation escalated. After curfew, Ramirez entered Alejandro's cell, accompanied by another guard. He ordered Alejandro to follow him to the prison laundry, an area not very busy at that hour. When they arrived, Ramirez closed the door behind them. "It's simple," he said, approaching Alejandro. "You collaborate with me, and I guarantee that no one will know anything. Otherwise, well..." He paused, letting silence fill the space. "It wouldn't be difficult to spread a rumor, wouldn't it?" Alejandro knew what that meant. A simple rumor about his sexual orientation would be enough to make him a target within Block C. He tried to argue, but Ramirez interrupted with a short laugh. "Don't waste your time, Ortega. Here, you have no choice. You are either with me or against me." From that moment on, Alejandro was forced to work for Ramirez. The guard used it to do personal favors, arrange small financial transactions, discreetly transport messages between specific inmates, and occasionally even spy on other inmates. Alejandro did everything reluctantly, but he knew that any insubordination could cost him dearly. Ramirez had complete control over him, and Alejandro saw no way out. The breaking point came weeks later, when Ramirez forced him to participate in a more dangerous operation. The guard wanted Alejandro to facilitate the delivery of contraband, cell phones, and drugs to a group of prisoners in a rival block. "It's simple," Ramirez said, handing him a small package. "Do that, and maybe I'll cut you some slack." Alejandro knew that refusing was impossible, but the risk of being caught by other guards or the prisoners themselves was real. That night, as he walked down the hall with the package hidden under his clothes, Alejandro felt the weight of his situation. He was no longer just an inmate trying to survive. Now, he was a pawn in Ramirez's dirty game. Each step seemed heavier, each look from the other prisoners more threatening. When he finally delivered the package, he felt momentary relief, but he knew it wouldn't end there. Rumors began to circulate. Despite his efforts to keep a low profile, Alejandro noticed that the inmates around him were talking about him. Some insinuations were about his connection to Ramirez, others about their supposed difference. Ramirez's control over Alejandro was so absolute that even when he tried to defend himself, his words seemed empty. One afternoon, Alejandro decided to confront Ramirez. "Why are you doing this to me?" he asked. Finally gathering his courage, Ramirez laughed. "Because I can Ortega. In here, power is everything. And you? You're just a rat who had the misfortune to cross my path." The response was a devastating blow. Alejandro realized that, for Ramirez, he was nothing more than a tool, a diversion. But at the same time, something changed inside him. He knew that if he continued like this, he would not survive. That night, Alejandro started planning. He knew that the only way to escape Ramirez's control was to find an alliance, someone who could protect him or at least help him resist. He knew that any false step could be fatal, but he could not continue to be manipulated. The silence of the cell seemed more oppressive than ever, but for the first time in weeks, Alejandro felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't know how, but he was determined to find a way out of the cycle of abuse and fear. The days after the verbal confrontation with Ramirez were marked by constant tension. Alejandro knew that his silent resistance had put the guard on alert. Ramirez was used to having complete control over the prisoners he handled, and the mere fact that Alejandro had questioned his authority was a challenge he was not willing to tolerate. Alejandro, in turn, was determined not to give in anymore. That week, Alejandro began looking for allies. He knew that trusting someone inside the penitentiary was risky, but he also understood that surviving alone was impossible. He approached a group of prisoners led by Martin, an experienced man who avoided getting involved with gangs and was respected for his neutrality. Martin worked in the prison laundry and used his position to help prisoners who, like him, did not want to be controlled by factions or corrupt guards. During a shift at the laundry, Alejandro finally opened up to Martin. "Ramirez has me in the palm of his hand," he said in a low voice as he folded a sheet. "He knows about me, knows I'm different." Martin stopped, looked at Alejandro and said, "You're not the first one he's tried to destroy. Ramirez has been doing this for years, but he only has power because no one stands up to him." Alejandro was surprised. He thought Ramirez was untouchable, but Martin's words suggested otherwise. "The problem is that no one has the courage to come together to face him," continued Martin. "But maybe it's time to change that." In the following days, Alejandro worked in silence, but now with a clear objective. He began gathering bits of information about Ramirez's schemes, the transactions he facilitated, the guards who worked with him, and the inmates who were under his control. Every detail was carefully recorded in his mind. With Martin's help, he gathered a small group of prisoners willing to take action. It was not an open revolt, but an effort to expose Ramirez and undermine his power. The opportunity arose one morning in September. Ramirez was organizing yet another contraband delivery, and Alejandro was forced to participate. This time, however, he knew what to do. While transporting the package, he deliberately dropped the object in the hallway, attracting the attention of another guard who was nearby. The guard, suspicious, asked to inspect the contents. Inside the package were drugs and cell phones, enough evidence to incriminate Ramirez. Ramirez's reaction was immediate and furious. He confronted Alejandro in the cafeteria, grabbing him by the collar and pushing him against the wall. "Do you think you can fool me?" he shouted, as the other prisoners watched in silence. But Alejandro, for once, showed no fear. "You can't control me anymore," he replied, with surprising calm. "If something happens to me, everyone will know about what you do here." The threat worked. Ramirez knew that if Alejandro had gathered enough information, his position would be at risk. Even so, the guard did not retreat completely. He continued to hang around Alejandro, but more discreetly, trying to intimidate him without exposing himself. The final blow came unexpectedly. A few days later, a surprise inspection was carried out at the penitentiary, ordered by external authorities. During the search, several of Ramirez's schemes were discovered, including drugs hidden in areas he supervised. The guard was removed from his duties and taken in for questioning. For the prisoners, it was a small victory. For Alejandro, it was an indescribable relief. Without Ramirez, life in the penitentiary wasn't exactly easy, but at least the constant weight of his threats was gone. Alejandro continued to work discreetly with Martín, helping other inmates avoid the pitfalls of the system. He knew he was still vulnerable, but he also knew he had gained something precious: respect. Even those who once considered him a target began to see him differently, as someone who faced power and survived. When the day of his release finally arrived in 2023, Alejandro crossed the prison gates with his head held high. He carried the marks of what he had experienced, both physical and emotional, but also a new understanding of his strength and resilience. As he looked back at the gray walls that had been his home for 4 years, he took a deep breath and promised himself that he would never allow anyone to control him again. Prison had tried to destroy him, but he came out stronger than ever,